With that, thank you for coming to my talk. The title of my presentation is Resource Rational Cognitive Modeling, an Information Theoretic Approach, and my name is Tyler Malloy. So firstly, I want to describe the research question that I'm interested in answering with this research, and that is how do human limitations in visual memory impact decision-making and learning? So this is a very broad research question, and it can be narrowed down slightly by proposing the following hypotheses. So firstly, I'm going to suggest that human visual representations are both information constrained and task dependent. Additionally, that human learning and decision making is influenced by visual representation formation. And finally, that these two effects are interrelated and cannot be fully understood by studying them in isolation. And through this talk, I'll try to detail what exactly I mean by these hypotheses. But first, a quick roadmap of the presentation I'll give today. I'm going to start with a discussion of the importance of the research question and why I'm interested in answering the question I raised. Then I'll go into some detail on previous models of cognition that are relevant to the model that I'm going to propose today, as well as some other related experiments. Then I'll talk on the experiment that I'm proposing alongside this work, as well as a more detailed view of the model that I'm going to talk about today. And then some preliminary results with work we've completed with this model and related ones so far. And then I'm going to conclude with a summary as well as a timeline for the project as I'm moving forward. So with that, I can move on to a discussion of the importance of the research question. So the purpose of this work is in understanding how humans learn and make decisions based on visual information, such as the following task of deciding whether or not it's safe to cross a busy crosswalk. When we perform these types of tasks, we focus our attention onto relevant visual information that we have available to us, like whether or not we're on a one-way street, whether the crosswalk is already busy, and the lights, whether they're red if the crosswalk sign is on, and so on. And what I'd like to understand is how humans form representations of the visual information that they attend to when completing tasks such as learning and making decisions. So one way that humans could represent the visual information that they're presented with is by minimizing the complexity of the representation that they form. In the case of crossing a busy street, this might look like representing the visual information as a single binary value, representing whether or not it's safe to cross the street. So here it's a 1 if it's safe to cross and 0 if we should wait. However, there are many alternatives, and on the other end is the approach of maximizing the representation accuracy. So in this case, it would just be retaining in memory or retaining a representation that contains all of the visual information that is available. So both these previous representation strategies have some good qualities, but they seem unrealistic given what we know about human cognition, namely that it is constrained. So accurate representations of visual information reflect the reality of the real world, but they require more work to determine which actions we should take based on those representations, and this leads to higher demands on our cognitive constraints. On the other hand, task specificity is negative in that it retains less information about the real world, but a positive feature of it is that it allows humans to achieve their behavioral goals and reduces the cognitive information processing demands of daily tasks. And in this work, I'm going to propose that representations of visual information are formed to balance representation accuracy and task specificity in a way that takes into account the cognitive constraints of the individual. So what this would look like in the crosswalk example is something like the following, where the representation uses a limited amount of information, which is being represented by the fact that this is smaller here, but it balances the amount of information that's allocated to features of the visual scene based on the task being performed. So I think you might agree that the crosswalk sign is relatively important compared to the other features of the visual scene. So in this example, that's being used to represent, there's more information being used to represent that. So with that, we can sort of revisit the original hypotheses I suggested and get a more in-depth view of what I meant by them. So firstly, I expect that representation formation of visual information is both information constrained and task dependent, and that this impacts learning and decision making. Secondly, the behavior of humans in learning and decision making tasks impacts the optimal balance of task dependency and accuracy when forming representations. And finally, the relationship between the visual representation formation and behavior is interrelated and cannot be fully understood by studying each process in isolation. So with that, we get a sort of narrowed down version of our original research question, and that can be described as asking how visual representation accuracy and task specificity impact behavior and vice versa. So with that, I'll move on to some modeling background. And in this first subsection, I'm going to describe resource rationality and information theory to give a view of how of the theories that the proposed model is built on. So before discussing in more detail the resource rational approach, it's important to understand its motivation. And that requires a brief discussion of David Marr's levels of analysis. So this analysis approach is described by 3 levels at which information processing systems can be investigated. The computational level expresses the nature of computation, such as maximizing utility if we're talking about decision making based on utility. The algorithmic level refers to a description of how the goal is committed to mechanisms that achieve that goal, such as this following equation, which describes the expected utility of an outcome in a decision-making task. And finally, the implementation level describes how these algorithms are realized in physical hardware, such as the neurons of the brain or the hardware that makes up a computer that is implementing a cognitive model. The resource rational approach is motivated by a desire to analyze cognitive processes at different levels of analysis. And the way that this is done in the resource rational approach is by grounding cognition in a common language that can be applied to different levels of analysis. Ultimately, the resource rational approach can be described or understood as viewing cognition as optimization under constraints. And there are many possible common languages that can be used to understand cognition. And in this talk, I'm going to suggest that information theory is one possible useful method for achieving the goals of the resource rational approach. So information theory describes a set of methods used to understand how information is translated within information processing systems. And originally, it was applied by Claude Shannon in his work, A Mathematical Theory of Computation, to understand how information flows through physical hardware like telephones, telegraphs, and televisions. But very soon after Claude Shannon described this unified theory of information, it was applied by cognitive scientists and psychologists such as George Miller onto understanding how cognitive agents process information. And this early work was focused around the informational content of perceptual information, such as speech, as well as the information requirements on working memory used in completing tasks, such as the number of digits that could be held in memory when completing a task. So in this work, I use information theory as a set of tools that can achieve the goals of resource rationality. Namely in describing the functioning of cognitive systems at different levels of analysis. And the way that this is done is by using information theoretic quantities such as informational entropy and mutual information and applying them onto a information theoretic understanding of cognition. And that's the basis of the model that I present today. It's essentially an application of information theory onto resource rationality. So in his original work, Shannon applied the information theoretic quantities that he described onto a general schematic of information processing that could be used to describe the functioning of various information processing systems. So this general schematic contained an information source that passed along a message to a transmitter, had a noisy signal that had some noise induced upon it, that passed a message to a receiver and then ultimately passed that along to the destination. And so this general schematic could be used to understand various things like telephones, telegraphs, and so on. So the terms that I previously described, such as entropy and mutual information, when they're applied onto this general communication system, can describe things such as how informationally complex the source of information is, as well as how much information is gained about the information source by knowing the value of the output source. And using these information theoretic quantities can help engineers to describe the optimal functioning of the systems that they design. And when we apply information processing onto human cognition, it allows us to use these information theoretic terms to understand things like how complex the task we're asking our participants to perform is, and to what extent the behavior of these participants is determined by the stimuli that we show them. So in the case of what I'm going to be talking about today, instead of the general schematic that I just described in the last slide, we have a visual stimuli that is passed through perception across a noisy channel into visual memory that ultimately impacts learning and decision making. And this is the general view that I use that motivates the model that I'm going to present today. So with that, I can get into a little bit more on related models of cognition that are relevant to the model that I'm going to propose today, as well as some previous experiments and describe how others have tested the phenomena that I'm interested in. So the first area of previous research in cognitive modeling that I'm interested in is visual memory modeling. And this research is focused on answering questions such as how visual memory is represented in the brain and whether or not we can predict human behavior in tasks that require the use of visual memory. So here is a simple change detection task that involves a stimulus that is represented by two different jars of marbles that have different colors. And the participant is shown two different jars. And after a mask period, they are cued with one of the jars that either has or has not been altered. And they're asked whether or not the jar is the same or different from the one that they saw in the same location earlier. And here, since the bottom left marble has switched from blue to red, it's not the same jar, and the participant has accurately indicated that. So part of the goal of visual memory modeling is doing things like predicting whether or not humans will detect change in these types of tasks. And there are many approaches to modeling human visual memory in these tasks. And one that has been recently used is the neural network stimuli encoder. So this is a method borrowed from machine learning research, which consists of a deep neural network that takes as input some stimulus that can be a visual stimulus, and then forms a low dimension encoding that is a representation of that stimulus that can then be used to form a noisy reconstruction of the original stimulus. And this shares some features with human memory, namely that we're forming a informationally constrained representation, and that we can then use that representation to reconstruct the original, similar to how we can imagine visual scenes that we've seen previously. And one way of, one more recent application of the stimuli encoder is called the variational autoencoder. So here the main difference is that these encodings, instead of being represented as the normal weights in a deep neural network, are represented as probability distributions. And this is useful for cognitive modeling because it allows us to apply a variable information bottleneck. And that is done in the beta VAE model by introducing a beta parameter which controls how much the distributions of these encodings can vary for a single stimuli. So the effect that that has is allowing us as modelers to adjust the information bottleneck by increasing the value of the beta parameter. The information bottleneck becomes more constrained, and by decreasing it, it becomes less constrained. And this reflects the reality of individual differences in information processing abilities that exists in humans and animals. And recently, these beta VAE models have been compared to the way that primates represent visual information, such as human faces. So it particularly suggests that the brain learns these latent units that correspond to a generative factor that is sensitive to an individual feature of the visual information being represented. So in the case of human faces, those individual features are things like age or gender, and ideally these latent units will be sensitive to only a single one of those. And results from this study comparing primate face area neural activity has shown a high degree of alignment in the functioning of the latent units learned by beta VAE models with the functioning of neural activity in the area of primate brains that is involved in processing visual information of faces. So here on the left is the beta VAE model, and it is the highest degree of alignment. And this demonstrates or suggests some degree of connection between the way that beta VAE models learn to represent visual information and how it is done in mammal brains. So with that, I'll move on to the decision-making setting. So the next type of behavior we're interested in modeling is utility-based decision-making, which is frequently used in studies of human cognition. And here we have another example task. So it's the same two jars of differently colored marbles as I previously described. But here, the two different options correspond to, if I select option one, I am told that I receive one of the marble jars drawn at random from the jar that I selected, and each of the colored marbles has a different utility associated with it, and ultimately my goal is to maximize utility. So I'm told maybe I'll get $2 every time I get a blue marble, and so on for the other ones. And the way that decision-making can be modeled in this type of task, it could be, for instance, using the maximum expected utility theory approach, which suggests that rational decision makers should choose the option with the highest expected utility, which is calculated with this simple equation. There are many alternatives for predicting human behavior in these types of tasks, particularly ones that focus on explaining why humans don't always pick the option with the highest expected utility, but I won't get into too much detail. It suffices to say that there's a large body of work in explaining how humans make decisions in this type of task. So in addition to modeling decision-making, we're also interested in modeling learning. And here, the main difference is that the values associated with the different options available to our participant completing the task are not known. They're not presented with the values of the marbles, and they must instead be learned through experience. So after observing many trials of choosing options of these different jars of marbles and receiving some reward after the options that I choose, I would ideally be able to learn the different values of the marbles and then use those predictions to determine which action is ideal in this learning scenario. So one way to model how humans learn these outcome utilities and probabilities is through the Q-learning function update, which is described in the reinforcement learning setting. So this is a broad field, and I won't describe it in too much detail, but many studies of human learning have motivated a connection between the way that humans learn the values and outcomes associated with different options presented to them in learning settings with the way that reinforcement learning is modeling by methods such as the Q-learning approach. And yeah, there's been very many studies that have made that connection. So beyond models that only look individually at memory, learning, or decision-making are models that integrate multiple cognitive faculties. And many existing models attempt to account for a wide range of behavior across different cognitive faculties. And the ones that are most interesting to me for comparison with the model I'm going to propose today are models that integrate features such as visual memory, decision making, and learning. And one such approach is a model that incorporates visual working memory with decision making. So here is a recent method that's been uh, proposed by Bates and Jacobs. This was in 2019, and this is an application of a beta VAE model that is used to represent visual memory representation in humans. And the top model here is this is the visual memory model. It forms informationally constrained representations of visual stimuli that are then used and copied into a decision module, which is then applied to some probe, which defines the task, the decision-making task that's being performed by the model. And then ultimately, the result is a prediction of human participant behavior in a categorization task that is based on the representation that they formed, as well as the task that's currently being done. So the specific task that this was applied onto was a categorization task that involved two different dimensions of variance. So here we have a set of potted plants that can vary either by the width of the leaf in the sort of x-axis or by the angle of the leaf in this y-axis. So this allows for two different types of categorization tasks, either by the leaf width, so thin versus thick leaves, or the leaf angle, drooped versus upright leaves. And this was the model that I just described was used to predict human participant behavior in this type of task. So the full schematic describes the operation of the cognitive model in this task. So we have the target, which is the visual image, the potted plant. There's a memory representation, a constrained memory representation of that visual stimuli that's then passed into the decision module. The probe is the categorization task that's currently being performed. And then the end result is a prediction of the category associated with that. And the results presented in this work showed a close connection to expectations of human behavior, as well as systematic biases in the reconstruction here, which is shown in the reconstruction stimuli here, based on the categorization task that's being performed. And part of the reason why I described this model in such detail is that when we see the model that I proposed today, you'll notice that it's very closely related. But before I describe that in more detail, I'll go through the experiment design that I'm going to use to test the hypotheses that I suggest. So the experiment that I'm going to describe shortly to test the hypotheses I stated is based on both working memory, learning, and decision making. And so it needs to test all those in once. And the way that it will test the hypotheses that I suggested will be in two ways. First, by analyzing the model that I propose against related methods, and then additionally by comparing the behavior of participants. So for the model analysis, I am going to suggest that the model that I propose will most accurately predict the behavior of the human participants in this experiment. And the way that that's going to be done is by comparing it to related models. And then additionally, I will analyze the behavior of human participants performing this task to ensure that it conforms to the hypothesis that is related to it. So namely, are human participants making decisions as if they are forming these representations that are both utility-based and information constrained? So the experimentation consists of two experiments. One is testing utility-based decision-making, and one is testing utility-based learning. And both experiments incorporate a test of visual working memory. So this is a unique experiment design, which combines both visual working memory and, excuse me, utility judgments. One second. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so in the first experiment, we are going to be testing visual working memory as well as utility-based decision making. And in the second, it's visual working memory as well as learning. So on half of trials, participants are going to be probed for a test of visual memory, and on the other half, they're probed for a utility judgment. And I'll describe now what exactly that would look like. So on all trials, participants are going to be shown the same type of visual stimuli, and they won't know whether they're going to be asked to make a utility judgment or a change detection judgment. So they need to retain in memory both the information about the utility of the two different options they're shown, as well as the visual configuration of the differently colored marbles. And we're using the same marble jar paradigm that I've been discussing previously. So a participant will be shown something like this in the decision-making setting. They will be shown a brief mask period where they'll need to try to remember the visual information that they're shown. And on this trial of the experiment, the participant is probed with a change detection task. So they're asked whether or not this marble is the same or different from the one they previously saw. This is the same example that I previously used, but this time the participant incorrectly selects yes. So there is in fact a difference, but they were unable to observe it. So as a result, the participant receives no points because they got it incorrect. They're told that they got it incorrect. And there's additionally going to be a progress bar that will let the participants know how well they're doing. And they're instructed that the ultimate goal is to increase the bar to full by the end of the set of trials. So after each trial, there will be another mask period. They're again shown the same type of stimuli, these two different jars of differently colored marbles, the same mask as before. And then on this trial, they are asked to make a utility-based prediction. So here they're choosing a marble and they're told that by choosing a marble jar, they will receive one of the marbles drawn at randomly from that jar. So here the participant chose option one, and then they observe some marble drawn randomly from that jar, and they get the points associated with that marble. So this describes the decision-making setting because the participant has the information of the marble values presented to them. And this is a full diagram showing the two different conditions. In the top here, we have the change detection task, which is half of the trials. And on the bottom is the utility prediction task, which is again half of the trials. And once again, just to clarify, the participant won't know which type of trial they're on, so they won't be able to, ignore the utility information and only focus on the visual information, for instance. So that's the decision-making setting. And the only difference in the learning setting is that the values of the different colored marbles will not be presented and instead must be learned through experience in the environment. So that describes in detail the two experiments that I'm going to run. And now I'll get back and reiterate how exactly this will test the hypotheses that I mentioned previously. So the main comparison for models in terms of the model that I will propose is comparing whether or not it is the best predictor of human behavior compared to alternative accounts like reinforcement learning, utility-based decision-making, and other methods that are commonly used in the literature relevant to each of those aspects of the task. And additionally, I will be analyzing the participant performance to see if it conforms to the hypotheses that I propose, whether or not participants are behaving as if they're forming these informationally constrained and task-specific visual representations, and whether or not there are systematic biases in their behavior that conform to the expectations of the proposed hypotheses. So with that, I'll move on to a complete description of the proposed model and how it is structured. So like I mentioned previously, the proposed model resembles closely the decision-making and working memory model. But here I am modeling utility-based predictions. So the top is a visual memory module, which consists of a beta variational autoencoder, which forms psychological representations of visual stimuli that correspond to what is presented to human participants. We then copy that psychological representation into the learning and decision-making module, which ultimately is another deep neural network that makes utility-based predictions. And then another key feature of this model is that these utility predictions, the accuracy of these utility predictions, are one aspect of the training of this visual memory model. And the way that that is actually done is with the following loss function, which is very complicated, but the important takeaway from it is that it balances three different aspects. Firstly, the reconstruction accuracy, so how similar the visual reconstruction of the stimuli is, so that's the output here, how similar that is to the ground truth. The utility prediction accuracy, which is how closely this utility prediction is to the true utility of the stimuli, and additionally, the information complexity. So the information complexity is balanced based on that beta parameter that I discussed previously in the same way as the traditional beta variational autoencoder. And the utility predictions are balanced based on a introduced upsilon parameter, which controls how much the visual memory module balances the importance of utility prediction accuracy when it's forming these psychological representations. So similarly, as the utility prediction parameter upsilon increases, the utility prediction becomes more relevant to the training of this model, and as it decreases, it becomes less relevant. So what that looks like for the task that I've been using as an example is a single stimuli option is presented to the model. It forms a psychological representation of it, which is then copied to the learning and decision-making module. It then predicts the utility associated with it. And if we're still training the module, this utility prediction error would then be used to update this module. And additionally, there is a information constrained reconstruction of that stimuli. So the way that this model will predict the actions of human participants performing this task is in the following way. For each of the options available, we will get a utility prediction using the model, and then those utility predictions are fed into a simple softmax function. This function is commonly used in both learning and decision-making settings, partially because human participants are rarely extremely deterministic in their action selection. So we represent them as behaving as if they're conforming to this softmax policy. And then the predictions of change detection for the trials of the experiment when the participant is asked whether or not a stimuli is the same or different from one they've seen previously. We will input the stimuli into the model, get those latent representations that are formed of it, the psychological representations, and then essentially calculate some weighted and normalized KL divergence, which is essentially just a representation of how different these two latent representations are from each other. And based on the difference between the latent representations, that gives us a prediction of whether or not a human participant will correctly identify whether or not the stimuli is the same or different from another one that is presented to them. So with that, I'll go briefly through some preliminary results of work that has been completed so far. So some of the preliminary work that's been done has been in the decision-making setting based on visual information. So here is the same jar of differently colored marbles that I previously described. And the marbles have the following values associated with them. So blue, red, and green all have lower values. This gray one has a much higher value. And what's interesting about this beta VAE and utility-based training method is that we can adjust those beta parameters to see how the information constraint impacts the reconstructions of the original stimuli that are formed. So in this case, when we set beta to 1, that conforms to a low information constraint, and as we increase it to 100, that is a higher constraint on the information bottleneck of the model. And additionally, by adjusting that upsilon parameter, we can control how much the beta VAE model cares about the utility prediction accuracy. And one interesting feature is that only by setting this epsilon parameter to a higher value does the reconstruction contain any of those high valued gray marbles. And another interesting feature is that only by applying an information constraint and using this task specific representation formation training do we get the correct number of gray marbles. So here there's 3 gray marbles in the top right example, and it's the same number as in the original stimulus. Additionally, one interesting feature is that the location of these gray marbles has switched, which makes sense for a model that's being trained to focus to a high degree on utility prediction accuracy, because the number of gray marbles is highly relevant for predicting utility, but their location is completely irrelevant to utility. And this is the type of, this sort of demonstrates in part what we might expect from a human that's performing this task, maybe one who is trying a little bit too hard to represent the utility of a stimulus and forgetting precisely where the location of each of the marbles is. Yeah, so that's some interesting preliminary results. The main conclusions from them is that reconstruction of visual stimuli in utility-based decision-making tasks shows some biases that conform to what we might expect from humans performing this same task. And the next step for this preliminary work is to use some publicly available data of human learning and decision making based on visual stimuli to see how well the proposed model can conform and make predictions of human decision making and learning in these types of tasks. And for that, 2 of the publicly available data sets that I've recently been looking into. The first is this contextual n-arm bandit task, where the visual information is these differently colored shapes that have different patterns associated with them. And I'm going to try to see if I can predict the behavior of participants in this task based on the visual information that they're presented with. And an additional data set that's publicly available is this set size variable bandit. This isn't the actual task that was used in that experiment, it's just a representation of it. But essentially here, the main area of investigation was altering the number of options available to participants and seeing how that impacts the learning of participants in that task. So ideally, the proposed model will be able to be an accurate predictor of human learning in these 2 settings, as well as human learning and visual working memory in the experiment that I proposed. So with that, I can move on to some conclusions and timeline. So just to summarize, the research question that I was originally interested in answering is how humans represent visual information when learning and making decisions. And to address that question, I suggested a set of hypotheses, essentially described by the statement that information constraints and task relevance impact visual representation formation and vice versa. And the way that I'm going to test these hypotheses is by constructing a set of experiments, collecting data from human participants in this task that requires visual memory as well as utility-based learning and decision-making, and then modeling human performance with the cognitive model that I propose, which is based on both resource rationality and information theory. And here's a brief overview of the timeline that I'm currently working on. Here we have the proposal presentation, which is today. I'm going to soon begin coding up the experiment, which will be run online, getting approval for it, running the experiment, and then comparing the models before I begin writing the thesis and ultimately delivering it late next year. So yeah, that's the completed timeline. And with that, I want to give a special thanks to my thesis committee, Chris, Brett, and Bram, and Tim, as well as the Adaptive Cognition Lab, Zemming and Rachel, the Perception and Action Lab, Nate, Scott, Grace, the IBM RL Research Group, Jerry, Meow, and Matt, as well as my funding source from IBM, the RPI IBM, AIRC, and the 2 leaders of that, Lisa and Jim Endler. And with that, I can move on to questions. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Tyler. So first we will open it up to just general questions from the audience.